Spoiler alerts for The Shining, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Doctor Strangelove, and vague hints of spoilers at Eraserhead. Please at least watch The Shining before seeing this video, but it's recommended you see all of those movies if you don't want any of them spoiled. While I had intended to do an analysis of The Shining for a long time, it wasn't until I saw it at a theater screening a week ago that I finally figured out what exactly I wanted to talk about. I figured it out when I paid extra attention to Danny. Specifically, it was the way that Danny acted throughout the film, very quiet and emotionless. I know for a fact that Kubrick was at least capable of having a child performance that was less cold and stiff, given Barry Lyndon and arguably Lolita, but while I always thought that Danny's acting was meant to make the film feel otherworldly, a thought occurred to me, and that's where we begin our analysis. Danny is traumatized. Now, I know that this topic has been covered before, but I'm going to explore the themes of the film as a whole using this as a jumping off point. Because when you break down what the film is about, common interpretations end up becoming tangential to what the film means on the whole. Sure, the film is definitely about alcoholism, it's definitely about the self-destruction of the family unit, it's definitely about ghosts in a metaphorical sense, but those are all just evidence of the main theme. As far as I'm concerned, the main theme is this. The Shining is about an abusive husband and father, and the wider cultural and historical context that both serves as a predecessor to him and as an influence on him. In order to discuss the film, we need to start with this, and in order to lay the groundwork for this analysis, I'm going to have to discuss Jack Torrance as a character in the film. Jack Torrance is often complained about in this film as being a less sympathetic character than Jack in the novel. To paraphrase critics, Jack Torrance starts out as an asshole in the film, so there is no descent into madness. I used to think that this was a good point in the novel's favor, but now I'm actually strongly opposed to the idea. Kubrick wanted to explore themes of abuse and trauma. Jack Torrance is the character that represents the kind of abuse that Kubrick wanted to call attention to. I think Kubrick had two main goals with making Jack an unsympathetic character in the film. The first reason is that he may have thought it would be, ironically enough, more realistic. If we see the end of the story as being a man trying to kill his family after a few months alone with them, the one I'd put my money on being more likely is the guy who is already filled with disgust and hate for his family before he even shows up to stay at the Overlook. I imagine the point of making him a total jerk from the start had a lot to do with making sure the character would be believable as an axe murderer. Making him a good guy with troubles means that there would be a credibility issue and that we don't expect that kind of person to go that far. But there's a more important reason, which is that while audiences think they want a sympathetic character, they really don't. The whole point of Kubrick's adaptation was to present Jack Torrance as an abuser, as someone who hurts his family deeply and who traumatizes them, leaving deeper emotional scars than any physical ones. To make that sort of character sympathetic would be to make an abuser sympathetic, and inadvertently make abusive behavior sympathetic. A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon both firmly established that Kubrick has a fascination with, yet a quiet condemnation of, abusive men. Certainly with A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick learned his lesson that when you portray a bad guy, you influence other bad guys to act on their destructive wishes. Both of those previous films seem to be asking what makes those characters come to be who they are. This is also a theme of The Shining, which we'll touch upon, but I just want to make it clear that making an abusive character sympathetic has a side effect of making people identify with and inclined to defend an abuser. For what it's worth, I think Kubrick struck the perfect balance. Viewers can clearly tell that Jack is not a very great guy by the start of the film, but it's not entirely overt about the way in which the film displays this. Think about the early parts of the film without the context of the rest of the film. Jack's early character would definitely seem a little strange, but you wouldn't think of him as an axe murderer or an abusive husband. Because until we know that these things are the case, we have no context for him coming across like an asshole from the start. People's complaints about him starting out as an asshole are rooted in already knowing what's going to happen. This is important because when we do have the knowledge of what's going to happen, it allows us to spot signs that we otherwise wouldn't have seen. He's an asshole from the start, but we only believe this because we know he'll be an asshole by the end, and so we're on the lookout for signs. So let's talk about the signs. I'm by no means an expert in psychology, or anything for that matter, but I'm going to go ahead and read a lot of this film from a psychology perspective, given what little knowledge I do know, and how that knowledge, as well as speculation, helps inform how I understand this film. One of the most important things to note about Jack, right from the very start, is that how he behaves, who he is really, changes depending on who he's surrounded by. While talking to Mr. Ullman and another guy who I don't recall his role, but I assume he helps run the hotel in some way, Jack comes across fairly charming and polite, more positive. This is also true when Jack sees the ghosts in the gold room, which is interesting because Jack is the only person who responds to any supernatural events with positivity rather than horror, only seeming horrified one time in the encounter in room 237. By contrast, when he's around his family, he's noticeably bitter every single time. The first time we see the family together, Jack seems annoyed with them and only seems to light up with a sarcastic tone while talking about the Donner Party. He's humoring Danny, definitely talking down to him, and openly talking about cannibalism to a child, which is a little strange. What's interesting, though, is that Danny says that he heard about cannibalism on TV, and Jack said it's okay because he heard about it on TV. Wendy expresses caution about saying such dark stuff to a kid, but Jack excuses his own behavior, saying that it's okay because TV did it first. This interests me for a few reasons, but I'll share two. The first is that it clearly shows that Jack doesn't care about Danny enough to care about properly parenting him. Not that Danny is too young to learn about cannibalism or that he shouldn't watch TV, but that Jack clearly has an absent role in Danny's life and doesn't seem to mind that at all, and doesn't really make any effort to be a father figure. He comes across like his family is a nuisance to him at best. The second reason why it's interesting is because, and this may just be a little wink-wink from the film, but TV serves as a small motif in the film, and specifically Roadrunner features, which is a small parallel to what happens with Jack and Danny, where Jack wants to kill Danny, but through wit Danny ends up getting Jack instead. It's okay because, like Jack said, Danny saw it on TV. Physical abuse plays a pretty significant role in The Shining, and very early on we're directly informed that Jack once assaulted Danny while drunk. At the end, he murders Halloran, and before that he attempts to kill Danny and Wendy with an axe. Aside from all of that, the most major question that we can ask as viewers about Jack's physical abuse is whether or not he choked Danny in the scene where Danny shows up with bruise marks around his neck. The argument is that you either believe that the film is about ghosts and that ghosts hurt Danny but Jack was blamed for it, or you believe that Jack assaulted Danny. I believe the latter, and here's why. First of all, in the scene where Danny enters room 237, what drives him to notice that it's open is a tennis ball rolling his way. The tennis ball was previously used by Jack as a means of killing time, though I would argue he seems to be venting his frustrations more than having fun. Second, when Jack is accused of choking Danny, Jack seems emotionally vacant and has no response. A typical fatherly response might be to ask what happened and try to figure out who did it, but instead he seems unable to speak for himself. And if you allow me to interpret the moment a little, it seems like he's more preoccupied with his pain of having a nightmare, and his wife showing no sympathy towards him. Thirdly, Jack responds to this by isolating himself in a fit of anger rather than clearing his name. And fourth, when Wendy reveals that she thinks it's a crazy lady in the hotel who did it, Jack makes it clear that he thinks Wendy is being ridiculous. Jack doesn't even believe that answer, and even after going to room 237, Jack claims that there was nothing there, and uses that answer as an excuse to blame Wendy and Danny for what happened, rather than put the blame on himself. I'll talk more about all of this in a minute, but for now, that's all of the evidence that I have to support that Jack was the one who assaulted Danny. The emotional abuse is much more prominent in the film than the physical abuse is, and the emotional abuse really contextualizes the physical abuse in a way. It's also where I get to my starting point, which is that Danny is traumatized. We'll touch on that in a minute though. What I want to start with is just all of the signs that Jack is emotionally abusive to people in his life. The direct signs. There's the scene where Jack chastises Wendy for interrupting him while he's working. There's the scene where Jack tells Wendy that his life was fucked up because of her. There's the scene where Jack mocks and insults Wendy about taking Danny to a doctor, and during that scene he shifts from belittling and scaring Wendy to guilt-tripping her into being more sympathetic to him, and then shifts again to threatening to murder her for his amusement. After he's been proven to be a complete piece of human garbage, he later tries to trick Wendy into feeling bad for him, and when that fails he starts laughing at her inability to get away from him. And this is where we can discuss Danny's trauma, because the way that Danny, and for that matter Wendy, behave throughout the course of the film present indirect evidence that Jack is emotionally abusive. But unfortunately we have to cover one more little thing, and that is the shining within the film, as in the supposed metaphysical force that leads to Danny seeing visions and so on. Talking about the shining within the film is difficult because there is no easy answer as to what exactly the shining is and what exactly is going on. The biggest debate among fans is, are the ghosts real? Are the ghosts ghosts at all? Or is it all just a metaphor? I think this is a bad way of looking at the film because they're not incompatible, and it doesn't actually affect the meaning of the film all that much. Overall, if the ghosts are just a metaphor, all that really affects is the plot. It doesn't affect the themes. But for the record, I think that the film uses supernatural elements as a metaphor for trauma and abuse, and I'm going to talk about them as though they were supernatural elements, even though I don't necessarily agree that the ghosts are real. I just don't think it matters to this particular analysis. We won't talk about all of the supernatural occurrences right now, but I'll eventually get around to most of them. For now, I want to make it clear that there are 4 separate categories of supernatural elements. All of these could be seen as shining, but in different ways. The 4 categories are supernatural occurrences experienced by Danny, experienced by Wendy, experienced by Dick Halloran, and experienced by Jack. This is important to distinguish because shining, as far as I'm concerned, seems like a metaphor for abuse. If we accept a supernatural explanation of the film, I think that the phrase, "some places are like some people, some shine and some don't," is super valuable, because that's what distinguishes the kinds of supernatural events. Danny's visions are wholly separate from Jack's visions in terms of what happens and how they affect the individual. For the record, I think that in a supernatural explanation, Danny experiences shining, Dick experiences shining, and Wendy probably does by the end, though that's not entirely clear. Jack doesn't experience shining in the sense that some people shine and some don't, but what visions he sees are examples of the hotel shining. I think that's important to distinguish because Jack never experiences any traumatic episodes throughout the film. The only times he ever sees anything supernatural, he responds with happiness. The Gold Room, the Room 237 scene, etc. show him in a happy state. I've still got to discuss more before we get to the Room 237 scene, which is kind of its own separate can of worms, but I want to make it clear that, whether you accept the supernatural interpretation or not, the symbolic interpretation of events implies on some level that what Jack sees and experiences is a different beast from what the rest of them experience. If we follow the idea that shining has a relation to trauma, then it all checks out. Danny has a traumatic episode in which he sees a vision of the river of blood, establishing early on that his visions are traumatic episodes. Later, he sees the twins mutilated, asking him to play with them forever and ever and ever, and he responds with horror. Generally speaking, every time Danny has a vision, he responds with horror, as does Dick during the Room 237 scene, as does Wendy when she eventually sees visions at the end of the film. Jack always responds with glee because he's not actually seeing his own trauma, he's seeing the trauma that the hotel presents to him. Again, I have to touch on that later. So now that we've talked about all of that, it's time to finally discuss all of the evidence of Danny being traumatized. First, there's the general vibe of the way he behaves throughout the film. Certainly child actors are a little awkward to work with because they don't ever do that good of a job, but Danny has this sort of especially absent look and feel to him, where his dialogue sounds devoid of energy and emotion, and he has a rather blank expression most of the time. I think this was deliberate, because I know that Kubrick is capable of getting a better child actor than this, given the children in Barry Lyndon did a much better job at emoting. I think the decision to make Danny expressionless and emotionless was intentional. I don't think of this as automatically a sign of being traumatized, but it certainly reminds me a lot of dissociative states that I've seen in people who have undergone trauma. And unfortunately, I include myself in that, because from personal experience, enduring the long-term effect of trauma for me has often created this feeling that I'm emotionally vacant from what's happening around me, and even feel physically vacant at sometimes. Like I'm not there or things aren't really happening. It feels dreamlike at best and nightmarish at worst. For the record, I'm fine, but I've been in bad places before, and my interpretation of Danny's behavior is that he's in a similar bad place that causes an emotional vacancy from what's happening around him. Beyond that, there's also particular moments in the film. The first shining occurrence seems very clearly like a metaphor for a traumatic episode, like a panic attack or a PTSD flashback or something of the sort. This is interesting because, as far as I'm concerned, this scene and parts of The Shining on the whole bears a passing resemblance to the ending of 2001: A Space Odyssey. The Stargate sequence used a lot of visuals as metaphors for what was happening both literally and thematically in the film. It signified the next step in human evolution, and tried to portray what it would feel like to achieve a higher level of consciousness. Dave approaches the monolith, a metaphorical visual moment occurs, and it's presented to us in such a way that we can't tell if Dave was seeing this, or if it was just being shown directly to the audience, and then the end of the film shows Dave reborn as the Star Child, the Stargate sequence filling a gap between the two. The River of Blood scene is similar in that it shows a character coming in and out of a traumatic episode, while portraying the traumatic episode using a visual that can be interpreted both literally as a shining vision and metaphorically as some sort of symbolic traumatic moment. Immediately after the vision, we see that Wendy brought in a doctor. The conversation between Danny and the doctor, and then with Wendy and the doctor, is interesting because it seems to get really close to touching directly on emotional abuse, but manages to shy away, by intention. Realistically speaking, meaningful conversations about trauma and abuse are kind of difficult for the survivors, and social cues and general stigmas and expectations often push people, both survivors and those they talk to avoid the conversation altogether. As such, the doctor starts asking questions about the episode, and then about Tony. I'll talk about Tony in a second, but what's important here is that Danny wants to end the conversation once the doctor says,
"Does Tony ever tell you to do things?"
I don't want to talk about Tony anymore.
Questions about Tony seem to be a sensitive area of conversation for Danny. On top of this, when she asks questions to Wendy about Jack and about Danny, she lights herself a cigarette and is visibly shaky while doing so. As far as I'm concerned, this is Wendy being nervous about the conversation, about Danny, and about her life with Jack. Wendy excuses Jack's behavior as the kind of thing you do 100 times when the doctor asks about the incident that caused Jack to stop drinking. Her excusing Jack's behavior isn't a sign that Jack is emotionally abusive to her necessarily, but it does fit in with the narrative fairly well. And the most important part of this scene to me is that the doctor says,
"I don't think you have anything to worry about. I'm quite sure there's nothing physically wrong with Danny."
It's like she's almost flat out admitting that there is something psychologically wrong with Danny. But rather than saying that or saying what it is, she leaves it alone. This is what I mean about social cues, stigmas, and expectations. To come out and say that Jack is an abusive father, and that's why Danny had a traumatic episode, would not only could possibly come across as insulting to the Torrance family, but would also be confronting an abuse victim about their abuser in the midst of it, which doesn't always go well. But more importantly, there's also the cultural value that Wendy and Danny should remain with Jack because he's the father and the head of the family. That is its own topic of conversation, but I'm sure that idea was much more prominent in the 70s and 80s, around the time of the film's setting. Tony is on its own an example of abuse. Tony could be seen as evidence of multiple personalities, which frankly I know little about, but I do know that it's often a coping mechanism for trauma. If we accept that Danny is traumatized, then Tony would be an escape from the trauma, a way to recede from the nightmare of the world around him into the comfort and safety of his own mind, where in his own mind, he has a friend who calms him in times of need and lets him sort out his thoughts. I don't think Danny is old enough or smart enough to realize that that's what he's doing, or to realize that Tony isn't real, and that Tony is a direct result of trauma, and so when the doctor asks him so many questions about Tony, he gets uncomfortable as he's being pushed to equate Tony with his trauma. Certainly the two are directly related, but in his mind, Tony is an escape from his trauma and not a symptom of it, and he feels uncomfortable being forced to think about Tony in relation to his trauma. Towards the end of the film, there's a point at which Tony is taken over and says,
"Danny's not here, Mrs. Torrance."
I interpreted this as a sign that the trauma has gotten so severe that Danny's personality has split and his friend has taken over so that Danny can hide his mind from the ever-increasing trauma of his abusive father. He's so far gone from reality that he isn't even himself anymore. Very much a complete dissociative state, and again, a pretty clear sign of being traumatized. I think the subtleties of human interaction play a much larger role in this film than some might think. Aside from the scene with the doctor, a very crucial scene is the scene before Danny gets choked, but after he sees the twins. It's the scene where he goes to get his fire truck from the family room, and he has a conversation with Jack. There's a lot of very important things going on in this scene. First, Wendy tells Danny to be really quiet to avoid waking Jack. She emphasizes it, seemingly because she's really scared about Danny upsetting Jack, which, to be frank, is not a sign that Jack has recovered from his past abusive behavior. If she was confident that Jack would fulfill his promise of being a better parent, I don't think she would be so scared to have Danny wake Jack on accident. When Danny comes in, Jack is already awake and a conversation ensues. Danny seems emotionally vacant from the entire encounter, never really looking Jack in the eye and speaking in a flat monotone. At one point in the conversation, Jack says, "I wish we could stay here forever and ever and ever." Remember, this comes shortly after the scene in which the Grady twins ask Danny to play with them forever and ever and ever, with cutaways to their mutilated bodies. Danny likely has a bad association with that phrase already, and the line, "come play with us," implies death, considering the Grady twins were already mentioned as having been killed by a violent father, essentially saying, "join us in death," and on some level implying to Danny that Jack is going to do the same. When Jack says forever and ever and ever, that would probably set off a red flag in Danny's mind, and he asks,
You would never hurt Mom or me, would you?
asking this question at all is a sign that things aren't right in this family, considering a healthy father-son dynamic wouldn't have these worries. But what's interesting is Jack's response. Rather than flat out saying, "no, never, don't worry," he says,
What do you mean? Did your mother ever say that to you?
He says this before saying anything reassuring, and when he reassures Danny, it's in a very sarcastic tone, as the soundtrack builds in creepiness. The whole scene is meant to be unsettling, and we're supposed to take from this all that Jack isn't super serious about reassuring Danny that he won't hurt them. A good father would make his son feel safe, but Jack chooses instead to pin his negativity on Wendy. We'll get into that later, but this whole scene implies that things aren't right within the family. The reason why Danny being traumatized is so important is because it provides all of these little subtle hints at Jack's effect on his family, and what Jack does that the film doesn't show. The story leaves a lot of things implied, and the greater implication here is that Jack is an abuser who has traumatized his family. But that's all focusing on Danny, when Wendy is equally as important to the discussion. Jack's relationship with Danny is fairly different from his relationship with Wendy. Personally, just watching the film, I do get the impression that Jack actually does care about Danny on some level, but by contrast has no regard for Wendy. Not only does he emotionally abuse her several times on screen, but Wendy also seems dedicated to tiptoeing around Jack at all times, even asking Danny to literally tiptoe around him. She's visibly shaky talking about the way that Jack hurt Danny, and just like Danny recedes into the back of his mind and uses Tony as an escape, Wendy uses the escape of believing a crazy woman strangled Danny, and believing that Jack won't relapse into alcohol and will actually stop being an abuser. It's very telling that before Jack ever threatens Wendy with violence, Wendy visibly makes sure to take a bat with her when going to find and confront Jack. These are all ways in which Wendy treats Jack, but what's more important is Jack's perception of Wendy. When she's not around, he calls her a sperm bank and a bitch to Lloyd the bartender. He refers to the 5 months of sobriety for Wendy and Danny's sake as,
Here's to 5 miserable months on the wagon and all the irreparable harm that it's caused me.
Lloyd then says women, can't live with them, can't live without them, to which Jack responds saying, words of wisdom. Forgive me for being a little overreaching, but that sentiment in general is fairly terrible in just about every way. Typically, the phrase is said between men while venting about problems with women, especially girlfriends, wives, and exes. It's a pretty toxic understanding of relationship issues because it tries to seek emotional validation by villainizing not just the woman in question, but women as a group. Even if you disagree with this, in the instance presented in the film, it's definitely a toxic sentiment because Jack is mad at Wendy for taking a stand against his abuse of Danny. All of this is to say that Jack doesn't seem to have the best view of women, especially Wendy in particular. It's important to note that when Wendy comes in to ask for help scared, Jack responds with no attempts to calm her down or comfort her, and instead belittles her before begrudgingly helping at her request. There's an immediate, visible difference between the respect that Jack shows for men in the film and the respect that Jack shows for Wendy. This will be fairly important later. Right now, I want to finally address Room 237. So Room 237 is seen by a lot of reviewers to be a symbol in the film, whether the events are seen as having occurred in the plot or just being a series of disjointed metaphors. It seems like a lot of people agree that Room 237 has symbolic relevance, as does the scene that takes place in it. I've seen a few interpretations, but I don't know if anybody shares my interpretation. This is what I got out of it. It's a metaphor for Jack's relationship with Wendy. Jack walks in to find a beautiful, almost supermodel-esque woman, naked in a bathtub, seeming to lure him in with the way she acts. When he goes in to hold and kiss her, he opens his eyes to see in the mirror that the woman he's kissing has turned into a corpse. He's disgusted. She starts laughing, and he runs away. In the metaphor, this is all perception rather than reality. The events, in the abstract, are that a man lusts after a woman, but only after embracing her he discovers that he's made a grave mistake. This has direct ties to both marriage and misogyny, and I'll explore both right now. One common perception of marriage is that men have to get tied down by women. Men all just want to have sex with as many beautiful women as they can, and women have to snap them out of it by marrying them. This image of marriage as inherently painful for the man and inherently perpetrated by the woman is common, but only held by, to be honest, complete assholes. It's misogynistic both in that it values women only for their sexual attractiveness and their bodies, and in that it blames women for unhappy marriages while absolving men of accountability for sexual aggression and unfaithfulness. And this is exactly what the Room 237 scene represents. Jack is attracted to a woman because she's beautiful. And when she stops being beautiful, he finds her repulsive. This seems to be a reference to his marriage to Wendy, and that now that he's quote-unquote tied down, he absolutely despises her and feels miserable. I could definitely see a backstory in which Jack has sex with Wendy, and then she gets pregnant and he feels forced to marry her to father the kid, but never actually loved her. Jack definitely shows that he blames Wendy for his unhappiness, referring to her as a sperm bank and a bitch, and shoving all of his problems onto her several times. All of this is to say, and I'm going to say it bluntly, Jack is a misogynist. I like to make my analyses center on a major point that I feel the film is making. If I can't use one sentence or one paragraph to aptly describe what the film is saying, then it's hard to feel like the film is saying something at all. Star Wars, for example, is saying that good will triumph over evil. Lots of films follow that format, whereas others seek to explore more powerful themes. Earlier I said that The Shining is about an abusive husband and father, and the wider cultural and historical context that both serves as a predecessor to him and as an influence on him. And I've spent most of my time talking about the first half of that, and not the second half. Now that I've discussed the ways in which he's harmed his family, I want to talk about why Jack is the way he is, and that's going to go into much more of the cultural and historical context. Now is a good time to address a common interpretation of the film, which is that the Overlook Hotel represents America. I agree with this interpretation, though I'm not here to present my own evidence for it. Certainly there is evidence for it, but if we run with that interpretation, the most important thing to me is the fact that the Overlook was built on an Indian burial ground, and that they had to repel a few Indians while building it. This, of course, plays into that theme as America was founded by taking the land from natives and going to war with natives, essentially committing a genocide. The genocide of Native Americans has also been presented as a theme, and there may be some weight to it, but I guess the bigger question to ask is why that's a theme in the first place. I think it has a lot to do with Jack Torrance as a character. See, I think Jack represents the white man. He essentially declares this himself when he refers to his struggle as the white man's burden, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. In 2016, people might refer to this archetype as the white, cisgender, heterosexual man, the specific kind of person who receives all of the social and political benefits of being an American, the same specific kind of person who, in large groups, slaughtered Native Americans and who quote-unquote built America. I think all of the Native American themes of the film are specifically about addressing that specific kind of person, the white man who asserts power over others as a white man, and how our history as a species, and specifically American history, influences and contextualizes where we are today as well as who we are. In other words, when we ask the question, why is Jack Torrance the way he is? The answer is, because there is thousands of years of precedent. Where we are today, or at least the today of 1980 when this film was released, is a culture in which white men automatically receive extra benefits that give them automatic social and political power over other groups. Men in general are expected to be leaders, to be dominant, to live the typical nuclear family dynamic, to be sexually aggressive, emotionally absent, etc. Our current systemic racism issues means that white people in general are culturally expected and incentivized to be racist and to assert authority over people of color. I'm not saying this because I want to start a political discussion. This isn't really a political channel. I just want to set up what The Shining is saying beyond just the context of the film itself. Racism presents itself in the film in a few ways. Not just the destruction of Native Americans, but also with Dick Halloran and with Lloyd the bartender. Earlier I mentioned The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden was a poem in 1899 about the Philippine-American War. The burden that the poem alludes to is the burden of white men to rule over and dominate people of color, as though it's the duty of white people to do so, and as though it's a good thing. If you can't tell, this poem is horribly racist, and Jack refers to the burden of his family as the white man's burden. This is important because not only is Jack basically announcing that he's racist, but also because Jack, as a surrogate for the expectations of white men in the late 20th century, is expressing an ideal that is still common to this day. When I come across white supremacists on YouTube or wherever they may be lurking, I often see the same rhetoric spouted of the white man's burden. The idea that it's the duty of white Americans to build a wall in order to keep out Mexican immigrants. The idea that it's the duty of white Europeans and Americans to keep out Muslims, Syrians, etc. It extends past just racism into the social category of being a white, cisgender, hetero man in general, that it's their duty to keep the social status above women, LGBT people, and people of color, and even over other men in their group. The whole beta male mentality, the whole alt-right movement, this all stems from a similar line of thinking as the white man's burden. I think on some level Kubrick knew this, that the white man's burden of 1899 was present at the time in 1979, even despite years of progress, that the mentality of correcting people of color and women and children as the duties of a white man in order to keep his place in society above others was still rampant. And this thread runs through the rest of the film when Jack eventually kills Halloran. Before that, though, he talks to Delbert Grady, and Grady even says that he needs to correct his family for bringing a black man, a quote-unquote outside party, into the picture. With the Overlook is America theme going, that would be a reference to bringing African slaves to America, but within the context of this film in our modern day, it's talking about xenophobia, which we see in 2016 with Mexican immigrants and Islamophobia. Jack is not only willing to protect his status by attacking and killing the only man in proximity who might be able to stop him from dominating, but he's actually asked to do so by Grady. I'll elaborate more on Grady in a minute, but what's especially interesting here is that Grady specifically uses the N-word to describe Halloran, and Jack's response is to repeat the word in disbelief. I won't even say the word because I think it's a foul word altogether, but even someone who isn't offended by the word would likely say, "What do you mean?" instead of saying the word out loud. Jack's not at all uncomfortable with disparaging words against black people, just as he wasn't uncomfortable with disparaging words against women. To put it bluntly, Jack is a racist. So the big question that a lot of people might want to ask is, why July 4th, 1921? Certainly the final image of Jack Torrance in a 1921 July 4th celebration is one of the most cryptic things in the entire film. Well, I did just a little bit of research for this and found that the U.S.-German peace treaty was signed on August 25th, 1921, declaring the formal end of World War I for America. The war itself ended in 1918, I believe, but the war state declared by the peace treaty wasn't put into effect until November of 1921 and was signed in August 1921. Before that, though, on July 2nd, Warren Harding signed a joint congressional resolution that declared the war state with Germany, Austria, and Hungary over. So July 4th, 1921, which was both Independence Day, the most important American-centric holiday, and only 2 days after the signing began to end World War I, was ideally a huge cause for celebration. The 1920s is one of the most interesting times in American history to me, because views on it seem to split into one of two categories: the brutally honest version of what was going on, and the highly romanticized. The 1920s were the roaring 20s. They were a time where America had a huge economic boom, and the culture was lively and vibrant. The romanticized image is that it was just a decade-long party. Of course, the reality was that they were dancing on the grave of World War I and preparing themselves for the collapse that eventually led to World War II. The excess of the 1920s and the failure to aid Europe at the time led to a collapse which caused the Great Depression. And the Great Depression hit America hard, but it hit Europe hard as well, and Germany got it extra bad, because Germany was left to pay most of the reparations for the war. I believe largely thanks to America's doing, though I could be wrong. This led to the destruction of Germany's state at the time, which created a situation that allowed the Nazis to come into power. If you look at the image of America at the time, you see it as a great time. If you look at anywhere else, it was a horrible time. But it goes deeper than that, because it's not America. It's specifically white America. Racism was rampant at the time, but the issues of racism between the abolition of slavery and the beginnings of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, those issues are largely buried due to a selective burial of those problems by our culture and what we value. Certainly World War I, World War II, and the Cold War were huge issues, and the Great Depression was a huge issue, and these issues affected everyone. But in the 1920s, the only people who were really suffering systemically were people who didn't fit that archetypal narrative of the rich white man. What I'm trying to get at is that the 1920s is a romanticized time, but it was also a racist, selfish, destructive time. And that's where it comes into play in The Shining, because the 1920s epitomizes the supposed glamour of the white man narrative. The major theme of the 1920s was cultural elitism. White Americans were partying at the expense of everyone else, dancing on the graves of natives both figuratively and semi-literally, in a country built by slaves. And as long as you sweep all that under the rug, things will be fine. It's the ideal that Jack Torrance strives for, the ideal that abusive, destructive, toxic people strive for. Jack envisions himself as the upper class, the man who is on top of society, and it is his duty to maintain that privilege by harming those underneath him, which is why he needs to correct his family and kill Halloran. The upper class that Jack sees himself as is portrayed in the film as a 1920s celebration party of rich white people. Jack holds to this false image of glamour so strongly that when faced with the reality of being stuck with a wife and child, it tears him apart. Whereas Danny found a friend inside of himself to get away from the nightmare of his life, Jack absorbs himself in a fantasy where everything he values is given to him freely. This is the ideal that the archetypal narrative holds to, that if you're a rich white man, your life should be handed to you on a silver platter, and anything that poses a threat to that needs to be corrected. Essentially, The Shining is about trying to hold on to the failing image of glamour that propels a person like Jack, and how someone responds when they can no longer believe in a fantasy world in which everything is easy for them. This is very similar to Eraserhead in about a million ways. I won't spoil Eraserhead, you can watch my analysis if you want to know more about the similarities there, but I think that's what Kubrick saw in Eraserhead, a sort of condemnation of men who hold to fantasies at the expense of others. A side note is that I've noticed that in both Eraserhead and The Shining, both main characters seem to not wear wedding rings even after marriage, and I think in both films that's a very subtle form of characterization and shows where their values as people lie. The isolation of the hotel, I think, is also relevant to this theme of cultural elitism. The elite, which I'm using as a shorthand for upper-class people either economically or politically, often isolate themselves from the rest of the world. Rich people stay in mansions just as Jack stays in a huge hotel, and they surround themselves with only people similar to themselves, just as Jack surrounds himself with a fantasy of rich white people. I know that this is an adaptation of a book about isolation, but I think that Kubrick was more fascinated with the isolation as a metaphor for the way in which someone like Jack might escape to a fantasy world in which everything goes his way. The film as a whole seems to be about Jack trying to escape into a fantasy only to be pulled out of it by a family that he hates. In the book, there might be reasons for Jack wanting to go to the hotel, but in the film it seems as though Jack wants to go into the hotel for the same reason why rich people in the 20s wanted to party all the time with only other rich people, for the same reason why some people come to America at all, to escape from current issues into a fantasy where those issues no longer exist. Now let's go back to Grady. I think Delbert Grady is an interesting character in that he seems to be just kind of made up. Charles Grady is the name of the person who murdered his family, and it feels to me as though Delbert Grady is a faulty fantasy memory version that Jack made up. Again, we can go into whether or not there are actually ghosts, or if they're just hallucinations or metaphors, but as far as I'm concerned, even if there are supernatural elements, Grady is supposed to be a symbolic mirror of Jack. People have already pointed out how Lloyd and Grady are both placed in front of mirrors directly facing Jack, as if to imply that Lloyd and Grady are just Jack talking to himself. Whether or not they're ghosts or just hallucinations, as symbolism, Grady is worth discussing. He's part of the cultural elite in that he's a rich white man at a party full of rich white people, but he's also a servant. I think the idea here is that Grady is a construct of Jack's mind on some level, whether that be the hotel metaphysically showing Jack a mirror character of himself, or whether Jack is hallucinating, or whatever reason you might believe. Jack sees himself as both the cultural elite and as a working class schmuck. He's the average Joe, a servant, and he's the archetypal white man. Grady is the same in that he's both a rich man and a servant. What this does is that in Jack's head, he could hypothetically create a narrative in which he can maintain an ideal of him being a hard worker and altruistic, while also being able to see himself as better than everyone else. He is both better culturally and morally, in his mind. At least that's what I thought of with the parallel there, and that fits a lot with the white man's burden mentality, which asserts that it's their moral duty to dominate because they're more sophisticated culturally. This also relates a little to white pride, in that white pride was a means of turning the working class against itself by selling working class white people the idea that by being white, they were automatically somehow better than anyone who wasn't white, meaning that you would be content with keeping your low rank in society as long as you have the opportunity to step on people who are even lower in the social hierarchy. Unfortunately, this problem is still very present in modern day America. The idea that Halloran is a bad person who needs to be corrected, whereas Grady is a charming, nice, helpful man who should be listened to, is similar to the narrative that being a white servant is still better than being black, and so I imagine Grady fits into the false image of being a culturally and morally superior person while still being a servant to the elite. The 1920s was a horrible time that, at the time, was romanticized so much by the people who benefited from it, mostly white Americans, and they basically erased the larger cultural issues going on in order to maintain that romantic vision of a non-stop party. Their selfish idealism, mixed with their de-emphasized racism, bigotry, and general toxic social values and expectations, eventually collapsed on itself, but the selfish idealism never went away. In other words, Jack, and people like him, hold to the idea that the fake paradise that occurred in the 1920s is not only possible, but the way life should be, and people like Jack are kind of taught that only they deserve it, and only they can achieve it, and anything that gets in the way is a threat. The film isn't about the 1920s, and it's not about the genocide of the Native Americans per se, but those are important in providing context for why Jack Torrance and the kinds of people like him act the way they do, and why they hold the values they do. A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon were very much asking the question of why does an abuser become abusive? And I think to an extent, both films looked at the culture that the main characters of those films were influenced by. Dr. Strangelove is an even more obvious example with Jack D. Ripper, a man whose blind faith in America led to the destruction of the entire world. I think that Kubrick wants to look at characters in context in order to make a point about those kinds of people. The man who murders his family does so because he believes that the world owes him something for being a man. The white man who murders a black man does so because he believes that people who aren't like him are a threat to the things that he has or wants that the world owes to him for his race, his gender, etc. The cultural values that are ingrained in us can't be separated from how we act within that same culture. I already discussed this in A Clockwork Orange, and I think the same is true of The Shining, in that Jack is a killer because he believes on some level that it's okay thanks to a long history of genocide that impresses on him the idea that that's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to correct his wife, to correct his child. He's supposed to keep them from bringing in an outside party, because if he doesn't, he risks losing everything. In the case of this particular storyline, he gets outed as an abuser, has his family taken away from him, and possibly goes to jail for domestic violence. Coincidentally, the first vision that Jack experiences is immediately after he choked Danny. They were alone in the hotel. He couldn't blame choke marks on an accident, so logically speaking, he would at this point be afraid of possibly going to prison for domestic violence and child abuse. Rather than accepting that he needs to make things right, he loses himself in the idea that it's okay to hurt others because on some level, they deserve it for being a threat to everything that the world owes him. For example, the world owes him a sexy wife, and since Wendy isn't full-on supermodel material, at least compared to the lady in room 237, Jack may on some level think that she deserves to be mistreated for failing to live up to his fantasy. Very briefly, I want to talk about generations. Charles Grady is the man who murdered his family in the Overlook previously. He did so in 1970, and Delbert Grady appears in the Gold Room during a party that I presume is 1921. If they were related, this would make Delbert presumably the father of Charles Grady. I think this is important because Delbert isn't the one who murdered his family. He never says he did so. It's a little off because Delbert claims to have 2 daughters rather than a son, and this is why I think that on some level, Grady is a character that Jack assembled in his head, a sort of combination of the real father of Charles Grady and Jack's own sense of self projected onto him. I don't know the logistics of it all super well, and I think that's partially intentional, but I see Delbert as a sort of generational precursor to Charles Grady, and perhaps a direct influence on what made Charles Grady become a killer of his whole family. Perhaps Delbert treated Charles the way Jack treats Danny. He says he corrected his family and basically implied that Jack should do the same thing. I also think the final picture of Jack in the 1921 ballroom has to do with generations too. That picture is super important to the themes overall, and I think it's saying a few things. First is that, in the ghost reading of the film, in a sort of metaphysical way, Jack died and went to his afterlife in which he finally got to live out the ghostly fantasy of being a gold ballroom attendant. In a metaphorical way, it's saying that Jack finally resolved completely to living inside of his worthless fantasy, which as an ending is very similar to Eraserhead. Also, it's implying the generational thing that perhaps Jack had a father above him who instilled the 1920s lifestyle idealism onto him, and we're seeing that Jack had always been at the hotel like Delbert said, that who he is as a family member and as a member of society has always been around. There have always been abusers, there has always been abuse, and there has always been Jack Torrance. Basically, the film shows generational precedent for the kinds of supposedly isolated incidents that the film addresses. Jack didn't try to kill his family just because he's a crazy person or just because he drank a lot of alcohol. There was some sort of reason beyond that, and I think the film is trying to explore that idea. Abusive values get passed down to create abusive people, and then we isolate the abusive people without critically examining the abusive values. And I think that's the bigger point of this film, as well as A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, and Full Metal Jacket. Now, I just caught this in the editing phase of this analysis, but I noticed that this scene where Wendy sees in the mirror that red room means murder is shot in almost the exact same way as Jack in the room 237 scene. This is important because it inverts the meaning in this instance. Jack's look of horror was referring to the revelation that he would be stuck with Wendy, that he had thrown his life away, and that she no longer has value because her beauty will eventually fade. Wendy's look of horror is referring to the revelation that Jack was not the good guy she may have hoped he was. Generally speaking, all of the visions that Wendy sees at the end are her gradually coming to terms with the fact that Jack is an irredeemable abuser. And this instance is the moment she realizes that there really is no future with him. The final piece of the puzzle that I think is important to discuss is the Torrance family as a whole. America has, for quite a long time, held a very family-oriented value about people in general. The values of the individual and the values of the family often conflict with each other, not just from a person-to-person basis, but socially as well. Our society often tells men they should be sexually aggressive, that it's okay to sleep around with as many women as they want, and that doing that makes you better at being a man. Meanwhile, our society tells men that they should start families, that they should get married and remain faithful to their wives, that doing that makes you better at being a man. Completely incoherent ideologies are presented at the same time, often by the same people. Remember when I said that men often complain about being tied down and how that's a problem? Well, this is why it happens. Men are expected to do completely contradictory things in order to assert their value as men, and it creates a kind of frustration that, in some cases, lashes outwards, as in the case of Jack Torrance. Essentially, the family unit, the nuclear family, the ideal of a man, a wife, and children with a picket fence and so on, is an ideal that can't always work. The idea that any one way of living life determines your worth forces people to live by standards that aren't good for them, that don't help anyone, and that make people miserable. It's not bad for anyone to want to have many partners. It's not bad for anyone to want to be married and have children. It's not bad to want to have sex with women, or want to father children, or to want to drink alcohol. It's bad to turn these things into something toxic, and it becomes toxic when it hurts others, when what you do and what you want makes things harder for others. The difference is that if you do something just because you're expected to by the world around you, it's not going to work well because your heart isn't there with you. Really, what I'm saying is that Jack in the film probably never wanted to be married or have kids, but at some point felt pressure to and caved in, and it fueled a discontent that got worse and worse after he had struggles with alcoholism, became abusive, and eventually got to what we see in the film. I think that the film is showcasing that the nuclear family expectation that society pushes on itself doesn't work if your heart's not in it all the way, and that by extension we can prevent the sort of domestic nightmares that we see in a film like The Shining by getting rid of the cultural expectation to do so. That's not just true for the nuclear family thing, it's true of a lot of expectations that society pushes on itself. The horror on screen may be ghosts, but the horror explored by the themes of the film, in my opinion, is the destruction of families, the abuse of individuals, and the corrupted ideals that lead to their destruction and abuse, and where those corrupted ideals came from in the first place. Now, I know I've been reading way into the film, but I do think that I'm getting close to something that the film is touching on. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, because this is just my interpretation, it's just what I got got out of the film by watching it, and this video isn't meant to be a factual document about the intentions of Stanley Kubrick. I think that it's in line with what Kubrick has said in interviews and what Kubrick has showcased in his other films, so the general themes here I think are on point, even if some of the details are wrong. Just remember that you're free to add to any of this or disagree altogether. The analysis portion of this video is mostly over, but I do have two other things left to address. Criticisms of this film and criticisms of analyzing this film. The Shining has a lot of critics who compare it to the original book by Stephen King. I haven't read the book and I don't intend to because I'm not a fan of Stephen King. I watched this film as a Kubrick film and not as an adaptation of King's novel, and I think a lot of people watch it either as a Kubrick film or just a general horror classic. The biggest criticism is basically that it's worse or even bad because it's not like the novel. You're free to like the novel and dislike this film all you want, but I want to go into possible reasons why the novel was changed for the film from an artistic perspective. First of all, Wendy in the novel was supposed to be a beautiful blonde woman, and I've heard she was a much more powerful character. I think this was changed because Kubrick wanted to emphasize that Wendy is a victim of trauma and not an ideal romantic partner for someone like Jack. In order for Jack to fantasize about his supermodel alternative, he needs a less conventionally attractive woman to serve as his bitter reality, which is very similar to Eraserhead thematically. The Doctor was a man in the book, but a woman in the film, and I think that has to do with some of the themes of gender that the film explores, where Jack's interactions with outside people are mostly men who he acts really nice around. Wendy's interaction away from Jack is with a woman who is kinder and tender. In the film, we never see Tony, and neither does Danny, whereas in the book, Danny apparently sees Tony a lot. I imagine this was to give a more realistic portrayal of trauma and to make the supernatural elements of the film more ambiguous. In the book, there's no all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy moment at all. I imagine this was inserted for a few reasons. These are all stretches, though. The first is to show that Jack never ended up working on his writing, possibly because he was angry at his family, or never took his job seriously, or had always intended to kill them. Second is to imply that Jack feels like he's been burdened by his family and wants to play, as in to live the glamorous lifestyle that he envisions in the Gold Room. Third is possibly to draw a parallel between Danny and Jack, and that Jack recedes into a fantasy to escape his harsh reality just as Danny does. The change from hedge animals to a hedge maze was partially because living hedge animals are frankly fairly silly, but also because the hedge maze serves as a way of disorienting viewers, and draws a nice parallel to the hotel itself. Not entirely certain of any thematic relevance though, at least not yet. The change in events from the book to the film with Room 237 probably had to do with maintaining the metaphor of Jack's failed marriage life, a metaphor that again keeps very strongly in line with Eraserhead, which served as inspiration on the film. Jack being an unsympathetic character, again, has a lot to do with abusive people and how framing an abusive person as tragic and worthy of sympathy inadvertently makes abuse itself seem worthy of sympathy. I think Kubrick also wanted a lot of the groundwork for who Jack Torrance is to be subtext and backstory, rather than directly showing why he acts the way he does. And so framing him as always somewhat of a piece of human garbage was a way of allowing himself the opportunity to tell everything subtly and indirectly. Alright, we're almost finished. I just have one discussion point left to talk about. Room 237. No, not the setting, the film called Room 237. It's become a very big thing on the internet that everyone has their own kooky interpretations of The Shining, and Room 237 was a documentary that highlighted a lot of the kookier explanations, and really they just let Shining fans hang themselves with their own rope. Whether they intended it or not, the message of the film is basically film analysis is bad. This is the worst possible message that a film like this could send, and it's become sort of a general sentiment among filmgoers that analysis is bad. Ironically, the people who think analysis is bad are guilty of doing it at all times. Everyone interprets every film. Every film you've ever seen, you just guessed what it meant, even if you did so subconsciously. When I say that Star Wars is about how good will triumph over evil, I'm making that up. I'm projecting that onto the film. I'm not wrong, but I'm also just saying what I saw and heard. Interpretation is how we communicate. When someone speaks a sentence, someone needs to interpret that sentence for it to be actually heard. The act of listening to someone is the act of interpreting sounds that they make. Interpretation can always be faulty and it can always be accurate, and that's true of any form of communication whatsoever, whether that be film or conversation or music or painting or body language. Interpretation is necessary and it should be encouraged, but we should also encourage healthy interpretation, interpretations that don't harm others and that don't implode on themselves. Room 237 takes a lot of ridiculous interpretations of The Shining and presents them, making interpretation of The Shining on the whole look bad. This is silly, and that shouldn't be a message anyone takes, because it destroys the ability to even watch the film at all. If you interpret the film as being about ghosts, anti-interpretation says you're crazy. If you interpret the film as being about alcoholism, you're crazy. If you interpret the film as being about the destruction of a family unit, you're crazy. If you interpret the film being about murder, you're crazy. Everyone's interpretations will look crazy to someone, and some interpretations will look crazy to everyone. But we need to actually evaluate which interpretations seem like they have any support from the film itself. Ultimately, a healthy interpretation will be coherent both in what the film means and also why it means that, using evidence from the film. An interpretation that says Kubrick faked the moon landing is incoherent because the film has exactly one thing that even references the moon landing, which is the Apollo 11 sweater. Meanwhile, colonialism and America have a number of direct and indirect references in the film, including the building of the Overlook, the July 4th ball, the white man's burden reference, the reference to the Donner Party, and to 5 Miserable Months on the Wagon, which both call to mind pioneers and manifest destiny. There's the references to the Roaring Twenties and the phrase, "loser has to keep America clean." That's a series of disjointed ideas that are all presented in the film. If someone can take those ideas and construct a coherent interpretation of what they mean in relation to each other and why the film would be saying that, then that's an interpretation worth looking into further. I feel like I've definitely tied things together with my interpretations, and it's up to viewers to decide if anything I said was coherent or supported by the film overall. If my interpretation stands, it should stand regardless of whether or not The Shining has been stigmatized as a film that only kooks see deeper meaning in. It should stand based on how much the film supports it. In short, to be anti-interpretation is to make the world of art a much less interesting and less useful place to be. It's best to encourage good interpretation rather than discourage all interpretation just because some are bad. In conclusion, The Shining is my second favorite film of all time, right behind 2001. I love this film a lot, and I could have said a lot more, not just in terms of theme, but in terms of just how well made the movie is. I love Jack Nicholson's performance. I love the pacing, the atmosphere, the sound design, the cinematography, the set design. I even love Shelley Duvall in this film. Overall, I think it's a masterpiece of filmmaking in general, and I think it stands as such, even when a lot of criticism is lobbed against it by Kubrick critics and King fans. I think it's worth watching for so many reasons, and it's a true classic that you don't need to know what it means to enjoy. Thanks for watching, and see you in the comments.